Hi, this is Outlaw Bookseller. Welcome to Reading List of Rock, the thread on my channel, or the playlist I should say, which is about rock music and literature. And because of the fantastic response from fans of my favourite band, the Stranglers, to the rather ramshackle videos I put up so far, though I do think the Capri Homer Golden Brown one was a little bit better, I'm moved to do yet another video. I do want to do a Bowie one soon and start broadening things out, but for now this is to thank everybody in the Stranglers fan community for really touching me by responding so positively to the clips I've made. So today I want to talk about Black and White. This, as you can see, is a still sealed copy of the US A&M edition. I've got one which I bought at the time. Obviously other editions out there, and there's a copy of the White EP in there as well, which of course only came with the UK one. Let's have a look at this just out of interest for the record fans. There we go. I've popped it into a UA sleeve. I get these from Covers 33, and this is one of the mushroom variants. You know, you've probably seen these. It might look pink, and you know what the consensus is. A lot of us seem to think that these change colour with time. This seems to change colour. I personally just felt it was a pressing thing, who can say. So Black and White is our starting point, and specifically a great track that we all know and love called Death and Night and Blood, which begins with that amazing explosive bass run and the chopping guitar, the swirling psychedelic organ and the steady rhythm of Jet Black. And Death and Night of Blood has a subtitle in brackets, Yukio. And back in '78 we were probably all thinking, what the hell is this about? Well, I'm going to tell you what it's about, because the Stranglers, of course, being, as I've said before, a great literary band, they looked far and wide for their inspirations, and one of them was the Japanese writer Yukio Mishima. I'll just put these shades back, and you probably know why I feel dreadful at the moment, to be quite honest. I've got a bad leg, and it's keeping me awake at night, and I have to keep it up. Luckily I can sit down to do this, and it's so boring. So I thought I'd do a little bit of shooting and editing, so do forgive me. And of course, you know, the ravages of time, an excuse to get the old JJ Banal type wraparounds on as well. It's always a good thing. So you know, it's good to get a bit punk about this stuff. So Yukio Mishima, this was the first book I read by Mishima, prompted by my listening to the Stranglers, and this is Confessions of a Mask, his first novel, an autobiographical novel. This is a copy I bought in the early 80s, published by Panther Granada, who later became known as Grafton, and that is Yukio on the cover, the colour photograph of him, and he's doing an imitation of Saint Sebastian there, who of course was pierced by lots of arrows. Saint Sebastian was a Roman soldier, a Christian Roman soldier and martyr, and Yukio was rather fixated on that kind of thing, and here he is being pierced by samurai swords. And there he is on the back, looking all muscular and heroic. And Death and Night and Blood, the actual title, is a quotation from this book. And as I say, this is an autobiographical novel, and in it Mishima writes from his childhood experience. He was taken away from his parents by his grandmother, who was quite strict, and he was brought up as the centre of the universe, so he developed quite an ego. And he was a really interesting man, amazingly talented. He wrote novels, plays, journalism, essays. He appeared in films, musicals. He was into bodybuilding. He had his own private right-wing army. We'll say more about that later on. He's quite a character. And JJ was fascinated by Mishima. I'm not sure how he discovered him, but being interested in, you know, Japanese motorcycles and stuff like that, maybe it was something when in a Japanese business. I just don't know, but I'm sure somebody out there can tell me. But this is the first novel, and this is a fantastic novel. And Mishima was homosexual, he was gay, and he was attracted to a night torchlight parade. And he writes in this about his feelings for crushes on young men and his own pathetic body, how he wanted to develop it. And it leads up to a moment where, as World War II began and the Japanese got involved after their attack on Pearl Harbor, he wanted to become a kamikaze and, you know, work for the Emperor and fly his plane into an American aircraft carrier and blow it up. and he bottled out at the last minute, just when he could have gone into the full training. He bottled it, and he said he regretted it all his life. So he had these very sadomasochistic sort of streak. And what's fascinating about Mishima is, for me, he embodies everything about Japan that we find fascinating. He was ultra modern. He was massively influenced by Western writers, people like Dostoevsky, Hamsun, Camus, Sartre. You know, he was somebody who was reading lots of European writers. He could speak English incredibly fluently. This film of him doing so, and at the same time he was very keen on Imperial Japan and on perpetuating its feudal structure. So of course Japan before the war was feudal, with an emperor who was like a god. Went through the war, the atom bombs, all that terrible stuff, all the cruelty the Japanese have been accused of in World War II in the Pacific theatre, and they come out of it a crushed and defeated people. And they go straight into high modernism. They are fated by the Americans. Their industry is pushed forward, and you know, by the 60s, 70s, they're an absolute industrial powerhouse. So we're fascinated by the clash of the ancient and modern in Japan, and Mishima kind of embodies that, because he's always looking back at the imperial past, which he wanted to be part of, and tradition, wanted to be part of. I'm sorry, tradition and that sort of thing. But also he seems very, very modern indeed. I actually met Mishima's publisher, Peter Owen. There's the Sigil, the publisher's logo at the bottom there. Peter Owen was one of the key people in publishing post-war avant-garde literary modernism in the UK. So he's a very important publisher. And I used to know Peter in the 90s. I used to buy some books off him to sell on through a mail order book selling business I was running at the time. And he's a great guy, and he had amazing anecdotes about a lot of the greats of modern literature, and one of them was Mishima. And one day I was at Peter's office, which was quite near to Earl's Court, funny enough, for hanging around fans, and I took this hardcover copy of Confessions of a Mask along, and Peter signed it for me, and he says there, for Steve, Mishima's best book, Peter Owen, 22nd of February 1994. So that's, you know, a long time ago. This isn't a first edition. I think the first edition was sort of way back in the 50s. But Peter published this in hardcover for years. You can still get it. It's got a different livery now. I'll show you what it looks like now. I don't have the current edition, but a couple of years ago they published 4 books in a sort of modern classic series. That's one of them. That's an amazing book called The Ice Palace by Tajay Bassas, Norwegian. And they've got die cuts in the cover. So that you see there is like a hole in the cover, and there's a design underneath, and they do Confessions of a Mask like that, and that's why it's bagged, because I hate die cuts because they rip. They're just a silly idea. Designers love them, but of course, you know, for those of us who've got to live in the real world, they're different sort of things. So you can still get that. And when I was at Peter's office that day, we talked about Mishima, and he said how eloquent he was and how interesting he was. And he showed me some of Mishima's letters, written in English in his own hand, beautiful handwriting, really lucid, you know, grammatically 100%. And remember, this guy was Japanese, and he wrote a better letter than you or I could, you know, had read De Sade to Marx as well probably. And it was fascinating because it was all about publishing stuff, royalties, that sort of thing. But to sit in an office in London and read letters by one of the great modern masters was really quite something. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to talk a bit about his books in a bit more detail for Stranglers fans, and tell you what you can expect from them. So where do we begin if you want to get into Mishima? Well, as I said, I think Confessions of a Mask is a great place to begin. It looks different now. It's got a different cover. It's still in print, as I say, in hardcover and paperback. Peter Owen licensed it out to various publishers over the years. I think it's a Penguin at the moment, so you know, you can pick it up in most bookshops, and it's really, really great read, full of self-loathing and being in love with the night. It's very, very much like listening to something like Ratish. You know, it's full of all those emotions: the darkness, the despair, the anger, the ire, the fire. You know, it's all there. The frustrated sexuality. It's really amazing book, and very black. I know Hugh Cornwell doesn't like them. You know, you can see why JJ would. It's very much his sort of thing. Well, the first novel I read by Mishima after that was this, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, which I recommend to people now. This is a lovely King Penguin edition from the early 80s. There's Yukio on the back there, and this is about a cadre of schoolboys who feel that their parents and the people around them are decadent, and that's reflecting Mishima's interest in getting the empire going again, how modern Japan wasn't pure and Japanese enough. And this cadre of schoolboys, they form this secret society to avenge themselves. And one of them, his mother has a relationship with a sailor. I think his father's dead. It's years since I've read it, but the feel of it stays in your head. And they decide to extract a terrible revenge on his mother and her lover. There was a famous film of this made in the early 70s, which was a real core celebrity at the time. And there were pictures from it, I think, in Playboy. I think it was Playboy. Made a big deal because it was quite risque for the time. It had Sarah Miles and Chris Christopherson, and it failed completely as a film. It's well made. I used to have it on DVD. I got it from the States about 20 years ago. But it failed completely because it wasn't set in Japan. So the feel was totally different. It didn't really get there at all. But it's worth seeing as a one-off if you can get to see it. But I would say give that one a try. Really good, really beautiful, balanced writing, amazing prose style, good translation, and quite chilling stuff. So that's a great one to check out. The thing with Yukio's books is that in most of them, there's usually a portrait of a character or characters with simmering resentment, unhappy about something, jealous, envious, sad, despairing, all these sort of like wonderful uplifting feelings which he specialised in expressing. And usually then there's a moment late in the book where there's a sudden act of violence and somebody's head is cut off or something, and they do kind of go through that formula. There are exceptions. I mean, a particular exception to that, if you wanted to read an exception to that, is The Sound of Waves. Sound of Waves is a delicate love story set in a remote fishing village, and I think it's on an island, I seem to remember. And it's just a really, really pleasant book, and it's beautifully written. So if you want to read a love story which is Japanese, that's beautifully written, go with The Sound of Waves. Interestingly, another great bass player, Mick Karn of Japan and Dali's Car, JBK, and his own solo work, sadly died very, very young of cancer in his early 50s. For me, one of the few bass players that can hold a candle to JJ. For me, my personal canon is JJ Mick and Barry Adamson, who worked with Magazine, later with the Bad Seeds, who are not really my sort of thing. He did an instrumental called The Sound of Waves, which is on the B side of his first single, which was called Sensitive. So there's a connection there between two of my favourite bands, Japan and the Stranglers, through Mishima. So that's a nice one to have a go at if you want something a bit more gentle. But more typically, you're looking at stories of revenge, violence, simmering resentment, and that sort of thing. And this is a Penguin of Temple of the Golden Pavilion from the 80s. This is a Penguin modern classic. And this was inspired by a real incident which happened in Kyoto in about 1950, when there was this very unhappy and mentally unbalanced student of Zen Buddhism who set fire and completely destroyed this temple called the Golden Pavilion. So it's worth checking out the film Mishima, Life in 4 Acts, but I must watch it again because I've not seen it for a long time, but I'm not a huge fan of it myself. I do find it quite ponderous and a bit too arty, and I'm an arty type of guy, as you can probably tell, but it is worth watching. Probably more interesting, I would say, to the Mishima fan, in my opinion, is a documentary that Arena made for the BBC back in the 80s. And it's probably on YouTube or somewhere. Typically with BBC, it's not in the archive on the iPlayer. It should be. You can't get it on DVD or Blu-ray. It's shocking. And that's really a really good biographical overview with film and what have you. And it's got an interview with Henry Scott Stokes, the author of The Life and Death of Yukio Mishima, which is a really good biography. I'm not sure if that's in print. You can probably get it online secondhand at Abe Books or something like that. That's really, really good, and I would recommend picking up a copy and reading it if you can. Well, with Mishima, there's another musical connection to another book, which is this book, Forbidden Colours. This is, again, a favourite Mishima. I really recommend this one. And I'll just read the back of it to you. Embittered by 3 broken marriages and some 10 unsatisfactory affairs, Shunsuke's abiding passion is revenge. His only pleasure is derived from witnessing the suffering of womankind. When he meets Yuichi, the beautiful, graceful athlete, and discovers that the youth is homosexual, he sees the perfect means to the creation of infinite female misery. So that's another one. You get these things where there's always simmering resentment, as I say, in a build-up to a horrific act of violence. In Thirst for Love, you get a similar thing. His frustrated desire gathered momentum that could only check by an unspeakable act of violence. But they're all really good, this is the thing. But as I say, there's a musical connection with this one. Forbidden Colours is the title of a song by David Sylvian and Ryuichi Sakamoto. So David Sylvian, again, one of Japan, like Mick Karn, and Ryuichi Sakamoto's in Yellow Magic Orchestra. He's done all sorts of work, collabs with all sorts of people from Iggy Pop, soundtrack work, all sorts of things. Very talented keyboard player. And Forbidden Colours is a song which appeared first as a single because it was on the soundtrack of a film called Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, with David Bowie, Tom Conti. And you've probably seen it. It's quite famous, came out in the 80s, and it was based on a novel called The Seed and the Sower by Lawrence van der Post. And again, it's not a favourite film of mine, but it's worth checking out. The soundtrack is fantastic, stacked with lots of these sort of Japanese sounding synth and bamboo type percussion, really, really good. And Forbidden Colours is a really fantastic song, beautiful song. There's a re-recorded version here on Sylvian's third solo vocal album, Secrets of the Beehive, and that's really good as well. That's mostly just piano and strings and drums, really simple, fantastic stuff. And I once heard Van der Post speak at a bookselling conference, I think it was in 1999 in London, and he was just amazing. I mean, he's a towering figure in world literature. He wrote exploration, natural history novels, and he talked about storytelling and myth and his travels around the world, and he just held an entire room of a few hundred bookshop managers entirely in his thrall, and that's quite difficult because we do tend to get quite cynical about hearing authors speak, but he got a standing ovation at the end. So do check out The Seed and the Sower, great novel, and listen to Forbidden Colours by David Sylvian, and do read the book, it's fantastic. Yukio has sort of come back into vogue in recent years. I mean, this is another old book, Death in Midsummer and Other Stories. I'm not sure if you can get that one. And, you know, it says on the back, again, he wrote about the same things all the time, but it's this obsessive quality that's interesting. Death, homosexuality, and the spiritual emptiness of post-war Japan. These are the often shocking subjects he explores. Well, his own life got more shocking because, as I said at the beginning, he had his own private right-wing army. There was only a small number of people in it. He used to drill them and they had uniforms and what have you. And I think it was 1970 he completed a work called The Sea of Fertility, a tetralogy, which is a 4-book sequence. He was married by then. He was a really famous figure in Japan. He got married just to sort of maintain the bourgeois sort of expectations and the lifestyle of expected in Japan. Because being gay was a bit frowned on, and he had quite this strange, outrageous camp life where he was in these musicals and did bodybuilding, posed on motorcycles, was into all this samurai stuff. So it's a real contradiction. It's the contradiction in Mishima that's really interesting, and I guess the contradictions in his life mirrored some of the contradictions we saw in JJ early in his days when he was trying to sort out his orientation and his beliefs about violence and confrontation and what have you, which we all know all about. So you can see why he was interested in Mishima, whereas he wasn't so interested at all. And he has come back into vogue recently, and as I say, the shocking story at the end of his life with this private army. Mishima finished The Sea of Fertility. He sort of stepped up from the typewriter and he went off to meet his little army, and they attempted a coup at the Japanese government office. He made a speech from the rooftop. The coup failed, of course, because they were a tiny little cadre of quasi-military figures. And because of the shame of their defeat, which he expected, there's no doubt about it, and also he'd completed what he regarded was his key work, he decided then to let his gay lover in the small private army behead him. He attempted seppuku, or harikiri, belly cutting, the crude term, as we know from our reading of Stranglers fanzines. He attempted seppuku, didn't go very well, and the sword wasn't angled right or something like that. So his lover took over and beheaded him. And there are pictures and everything of this. You can probably find them online if you want to. And you know, that was the end to Mishima's life and his career. And he was up for the Nobel Prize, and he didn't win it because he was quite young when he attempted this act, because it tended to go to older people, and a lot of people who should have won the Nobel Prize for Literature didn't, because they died just before it could be awarded. There's like sort of a gradation. They'd go to older people first, and he would have won it had he lived. There's no doubt about that. But he'd lived enough, and he wanted to make a statement. He forced his body to be his weapon in his statement. And you know, he never escaped, obviously, from those feelings of frustration about post-war Japan, his turmoil at being homosexual, and his desire to be a great warrior when he wasn't. So it's a very difficult thing for Yukio, but fascinating man. So do try and get hold of the biography by Henry Scott Stokes. It's really good. Some of more of his work has been translated. Frolic of the Beast came out in Penguin Modern Classics a couple of years ago. I haven't actually read this yet. I'm still saving them up now, because for years I haven't had any new Yukio to read. So it's good to have some new stuff aside for when I'm in the mood. And Life for Sale, also in Penguin Modern Classics. They're doing these large format paperbacks in wraps at the moment, which are rather nice. They tend to do some of the new important ones like that, and instead of a hardcover, then a year later they bring them down into the standard format. So they're worth looking out for. I've got those aside for when I'm in a mood for, you know, his extremely self-destructive and strange work. But it is quite easy to read. You know, it's accessible but well written. So I would say for the Stranglers fan who is new to Mishima, probably the best place to start, and you may want to finish as well, just the one-off might sit you with Confessions of a Mask, still in print. As I say, Temple of the Golden Pavilion is a fantastic one. Forbidden Colours is a great one. I'm just going to show you one more. This is a little limited edition chapbook the Penguin did a few years ago. They do these every time they have an anniversary, and this was the anniversary of Penguin Modern Classics. And this is Star. A movie star is confronted by the absurdity of his existence in this brutal dissection of fame by a Japanese literary icon. So just a short story. And I'm yet to read that as well, because there's only one book of his stories that have been translated. There's lots of other stuff, maybe it'll appear one day. So whenever you are confronted by visions of death and night and blood, turn to black and white and turn to Yukio. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out. There'll be more Stranglers clips to come soon. I'm going to talk about science fiction and the Stranglers, and I'm going to talk about the strange career of Bernard Wolfe, who is referred to tangentially in a classic track from La Folie, Ain't Nothing to It, and also in the references to Trotsky in No More Heroes and Hugh Cornwell's Big Bug. Bye for now.